Evening. Welcome to the National Council for History Education's Back to School webinar series. My name is Dalton Savage, and I am one of the education coordinators for NCHE. I also have my colleague here, Kathleen Barker, with NCHE. She's another education coordinator. And then we have the pleasure of having Dr. Joanne Freeman here with us to talk about the First Continental Congress. I'm going to start again by reading a little bit about Joanne and then turning it over to her. A lot of you have already started, but if you would just introduce yourself in the chat, tell us where you're joining us from. It's always good to see all the representation within the chat. And feel free to comment, chime in, etc. in the chat throughout. And then there will be a Q&A period to where Joanne will be able to answer some of your questions towards the end. This is Dr. Joanne Freeman. I'm professor of history and American studies at Yale University, where she specializes in early American politics and political culture. Her interest in political violence and political polarization has made her work particularly relevant within our last few years. Freeman has long been committed to public-minded history, co-host of the popular American history podcast Backdoor. Freeman is a frequent public speaker, commentator, and historical consultant whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic Magazine, among others. She's been featured in documentaries on PBS and the History Channel, and has been a political commentator on CNN and MSNBC. She also hosts our Friday History Matters and So Does Coffee podcast here at NCHE. And again, we're just so lucky to have her here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her and then let her get started. Thank you, Joanne.
Sure. Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to be here. Talk a little bit about the First Continental Congress. I guess I'll start out by saying some of the things that I'm saying might sound very logical, but probably aren't things that we tend to think about very often, and some of them might not be logical at all. So come along with me. But the first thing I want to say is when you're looking at anything that has to do with the American Revolution, the simple phrase American Revolution suggests that whatever happens has to do with a war, a revolution. So, for example, that somehow the First Continental Congress was about the war or about independence or about the things that we know ultimately happen. But you'll see some of what I'm going to be talking about this evening has to do with all of the ways in which the First Continental Congress was trying really hard to make things okay, to reconcile things. And so part of what I'm going to talk about is the logic of what they were doing and what people in the First Continental Congress were angry about or nervous about, but really almost more important, given all the things we assume about the American Revolution, why they ultimately didn't really take extreme action, given how angry they were, and given that there were some radical people in the First Continental Congress, but there were also some loyalist types. So at any rate, hopefully by the end, and certainly you can ask questions when we get to the end, you'll get a sense of the sort of weaving in and out in the First Continental Congress of feelings about the king and parliament, not always the same about both, and feelings about who the colonies were and what they were within the British Empire. Now, just a quick bit of backup here. So go all the way back, going to the 1750s, the early 1760s. Part of what ends up with the First Continental Congress is the French and Indian War. French and Indian War obviously was fought within the colonies and west of the colonies. It was expensive for Great Britain. And when it ended, Great Britain had a lot of debt, and they had to figure out what to do to make up that debt. And they left behind a lot of soldiers in and around the colonies, and they had to pay for that as well. So basically, the French and Indian War left Britain in some financial trouble, and they had to reconfigure things to figure out how to get better financial control of the empire. And this doesn't often make it into American history books, but before Parliament clamped down on the colonies to make up money from the French and Indian War, they actually first passed a number of acts that affected British subjects, taxes and other such things. So they did do some things, at home, not in the colonies, to try and get some of that money back. But then, as we all know, they turned to the colonies. And initially, they did things that probably to Parliament and the king did not seem radical, like they decided to clamp down on smuggling. Right? We're losing a lot of money with smuggling in the colonies. Let's clamp down on smuggling. Let's give some extra power to customs office workers, and we'll make more money up that way, which hardly seems radical if you're looking from the British side of the ocean. To the colonists, they were very pleased with how things had been burbling along, right? They were fine with the system as it had been going, and all of a sudden there's clamping down on smuggling. There were some new duties passed on goods. Duties, so we're still talking about things coming in from outside of the colonies, but still, they're new. Then you ended up having the Currency Act, which again, this is financial. This is Great Britain trying to get financial organization here. And the Currency Act said the colonies can't issue their own money, right? We want to be in charge of this. We want to be in charge of currency, so the colonies can't issue their own money. And any act passed by a colonial legislature that violated that idea was null and void. Okay, bear that in mind. So it's like one thing to say you can't issue money. It's another thing to say, we don't care if your colonial legislature passed an act about this. It's null and void. So whatever your colonial legislature did, it really doesn't matter. So at any rate, I won't go into all of the details of all of the acts, but you have a number of acts being passed, having duties and a variety of other things, so that the British government can get back some of the money it spent on the French and Indian War. But in the process, a system that had been happily going along for the colonists for quite some time is changing. And all of a sudden you have, this is actually a quote from a radical, a Massachusetts radical named James Otis. He says, that these acts, quote, set people a-thinking in 6 months, more than they had done in their whole lives before. So all of a sudden, these things are happening, and clamping down on smuggling and nullifying an act by a legislature, and maybe doing some of this to get money to fund soldiers in the colonies. Would that be a standing army? So there are things happening that are causing concern among the colonists. And in their mind, and this is important, striking at fundamental British rights and privileges. And this is going to be true throughout the meeting of the First Continental Congress. There are radicals in that Congress, but more than anything else, colonists are concerned with their rights as British subjects. So they're not saying freedom, independence, we're radicals, we're revolting. They were saying, we're British subjects just like anybody back in England. We deserve the same rights. Why are we not being given those rights? That's not the way we tend to think about the beginning of the American Revolution. But indeed, initially, it was about these colonists feeling that they were not being treated as regular British subjects, that they were having rights denied, and they couldn't figure out, we'll see in a moment, they couldn't figure out how to protest, how to take action, how to say in a way that would be heard that what was happening wasn't fair. So then you get, in 1765, and as I said, I'm not going to go into all of these acts, you get the Stamp Act in 1765. That one really panics people because colonists generally were fine with duties, taxes basically passed on things coming into the colony. But when you begin to have taxes on things already in the colonies, so internal taxes, not duties, that also was a new scary innovation. Wait a minute. We deal with what goes on in the colonies. You can deal with importing and exporting. We deal with the stuff internally speaking. So again, you have the way things have been operating being upset. Colonies don't necessarily understand where it's going, but they're doing what anyone does when there's big changes. They're putting the pieces together and trying to figure out what it means. So as these acts pass, as things go on and the acts are passing, and obviously people in the colonies, throughout the colonies, particularly Massachusetts and Virginia, but throughout the colonies, are trying to figure out what this means. And by a certain point, it becomes clear, and I'd say by like 1770, it becomes clear that somehow or other, what's happening now is no longer Parliament passing acts and the colonies objecting. Now it's become a bigger argument. So after years of this going on, it moves on to become seemingly an issue about the sovereignty of Parliament over the colonies. So to those in Parliament, as the colonies are resisting, as they're not following through, as they're standing up for their rights as subjects, Parliament begins to feel that their sovereignty over the colonies is bound up with their right to tax Americans. These two things get absolutely cemented together, which means Parliament can't simply back down on a tax. Oops, sorry, without seeming to give up their sovereignty over the colonies. So after a certain number of years, you're now at a point where what's the argument on both sides has now taken on more meaning. So Lord North, who is the prime minister by 1770, a little bit later, but around 1770, he's trying to figure out what to do. And he decides, you know what? He will withdraw a lot of the taxes because they're so unpopular, and he'll just leave one tax in place to prove that England actually does reign supreme over its colonies. Around that same time, and this is when we're now moving into tea, he passes the Tea Act of 1773. Now, he passes this because the East India Tea Company was in financial trouble, and North says, okay, you know what? Tea Act of 1773, I'm going to remove import duties on East India tea, so British tea will be cheaper than other tea. And then the colonists will buy British tea, and everyone will be thrilled. The colonists have cheaper tea, the East India Tea Company gets money, and the colonists will be so happy with us because we're reducing import duties. The colonists, given everything that's happening here, interprets this in part by saying, are they trying to get a monopoly on tea? Like, why? What is this about? What's the logic of this, given everything else that's happening? So they begin even to suspect that. So things intensify, particularly now with the tea, and the colonists don't want the tea to be, emptied out on British tea on American shores and American ports because they don't fully understand what's happening and they're objecting to this system. And you get to, in December of 1773, what later in time in the 19th century came to be called the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was essentially Boston colonists hearing not only that there was a ship in the harbor with tea on it, but the governor of Massachusetts at the time ordered it to be unloaded, the royal governor, trying to make a stand for the royal government, right? We're going to unload that tea. We don't care what the colonists think. And the colonists, when they got word that there was going to be this tea unloaded, bells began ringing. People heard and passed word back and forth, the tea's being unloaded, and people went down to the port of Boston and threw some of the tea into the harbor. Now, it's interesting that again, there's so many things about the revolution that we think the word revolution leads us astray, and we think, attack, kill. The so-called Boston Tea Party was very orderly. I mean, people were disguised, the colonists were disguised. They apparently brought a locksmith to undo the lock to the hold in the ship so that they wouldn't damage the ship while they were getting the tea. They were making a point, but they weren't in a state of rampage. They were very literally making a point. But regardless, back in England, they were dumbfounded. Lord North said, quote, he thought he'd given the colonies a relief instead of an oppression. And now he had to conclude that these were New England fanatics. He just couldn't really understand what they were doing. So now he begins to think, whatever's going on here, is proof that we're not talking about taxation, but we're talking about whether Britain has any authority over what he calls haughty American Republicans, small r. So there's all of this debate in Parliament about what this means. And in response to the Tea Party, you get the passage of what they call the coercive acts in England and what they call the intolerable acts in the colonies, 1774. And these are pretty extreme. So the intolerable acts close off the port of Boston, take control of Massachusetts government and appoint a new military governor, give, as part of a quartering act, they legalize the quartering of troops, not just in taverns, but in private homes. So now we have the government, the colonial government being taken over, the port of Boston being closed, the troops being quartered in private homes. This is extreme. And it's this kind of passage of these kinds of acts that leads to the call for the First Continental Congress. Now, it's important to note, and this goes back to where I started, the calling of the First Continental Congress wasn't a sign that the American colonies were united and ready to prepare for revolution. They hoped still that things could be resolved. And it was partly in a spirit of reconciliation that the Massachusetts legislature sent a circular letter out to other colonies suggesting some kind of joint Congress to discuss their problems. And so the First Continental Congress meets in the fall of 1774. And as they're meeting, they're doing things that are the things one tries to do when you're trying to resolve a problem, right? They're trying to come up with resolves that they can pass about what they want. They're trying to debate what they feel their rights are so that they can just state them very plainly. They're doing things that they hope will resolve the situation, not things that are declaring independence or making very bold radical statements. Although, as I said a little while back, there were some radicals in the First Continental Congress. Now, there are two points I want to make about the Continental Congress. And it has to do with the word continental and the word Congress. And you'll see the logic of this. So the First Continental Congress is in part noteworthy because of the continental aspect of it. Because what they were doing in the First Continental Congress in a way that hadn't been done before was trying to bring the colonies together. And they were like independent nation states in this time period. They didn't necessarily know a lot about each other. People who went to both Continental Congresses sometimes were stunned to see what people from other colonies were like. They really, in some ways, were as though they were people from foreign countries. So the Continental Congress, the name suggests, okay, we're trying to do something that's big, maybe not the entire continent, but big. And it's going to be bringing people together who don't know each other to form some kind of unity and do something together. The continental aspect of it was pretty radical. And again, I won't go into great detail, but there had been a handful of attempts in the past for the colonies to come together and do something together. Typically, it would happen when there was a big problem, like a threat from Native Americans or some such thing, and the colonies would temporarily come together to deal with the threat, and then the threat would go away, and the colonies wanted nothing to do with each other anymore. So now, or again, there's a threat. The colonies are coming together, First Continental Congress, and figuring out what to do. So they talk about establishing boycotting. I'm going to come back to this in a moment when I talk about the Congress half. They talk about boycotting. They even debate, Joseph Galloway debates, maybe we need a plan of union, right? Again, continental unity. Maybe there should be some kind of plan of union, and there could be like a separate American legislature elected by colonial assemblies, which would be inferior to Parliament, but could veto parliamentary legislation, which, he is someone who's more loyalist in his leanings, but that's a pretty radical idea. The idea behind it is no law should bind America, the American colonies, without their consent. This does not pass because it's seen as radical. Okay, so continental, part of what the Continental Congress is doing is bringing people together and trying to do something in an organized manner over a broad sweep of land in a way that hadn't been successfully done before. The other thing that the Continental Congress is doing, the Congress part, is trying to set up something kind of institutional, something kind of networky that can enable these colonies to communicate with each other, to cooperate with each other in ways that hadn't happened before. Again, really think of these as independent nation states. When further in time, you get the Articles of Confederation, I encourage you to go look and see what they say and how they're written. Very much the Articles of Confederation sound like a kind of UN in which they will bring together these nation states and together they can talk about things, but the Confederation Congress has no power to do anything. So the independence of these colonies from each other is a constant throughout this time period. So the Congress part, they want to create something semi-institutional-ish. And so already there were committees of correspondence throughout the colonies, which were mostly about communication more than anything else, trying to have people in one colony understand what the heck was happening in another colony. But these local committees not only can deal with correspondence, but you begin to have local non-importation committees, local committees that are about enforcing some of what the colonies want to do to push back against Britain. And boycotting British goods is one way in which they're like, okay, this will do it. This will get them. This will affect their manufacturing. And then they'll listen to us and we'll get what we want. So they create, First Continental Congress, a network of local non-importation committees, and they call it the Continental Association. And it includes all kinds of localized committees of inspection, and they are partly inspecting what people are buying, what people are using to make sure that people aren't, for example, drinking tea or buying British luxuries. So this is important in part because it's network-ish. It's creating like an infrastructure of something where there was nothing before. And it's an infrastructure, but it's really localized. It's lots of little local associations that add up to the one big association. So they're kind of creating a base. They don't know, again, looking forward in time, not back. All they're trying to do is have cooperation, communication, a successful boycott, and they're putting things in motion that will enable them to do that. But down the road, in ways that they couldn't anticipate, it becomes really important in organizing what becomes ultimately a war effort and maintaining order throughout the war. So they're doing things in the moment to communicate, to help with the boycott. Down the road, a couple of years down the road, this is going to be a really important communication and coordination infrastructure for the colonies as war begins to seem like a possibility. The other thing that this Continental Association does is it brings thousands of people into this controversy as committee members, as inspectors, as boycotters. So on the one hand, you have the continental part in which they're reaching out and trying to embrace all of the colonies. And the other hand, you have the Congress part in which they're creating institutional infrastructures that will stick around, be reshaped over time, but still pretty major, and they didn't exist before. Two last things I'll mention because I want to have time to open things up to questions so that you guys can ask questions. One of the things that this First Continental Congress does is it passes the Declaration and Resolves, which state the Congress's objections to the coercive acts. And in doing that, they essentially create a kind of a list of rights that they feel colonists have. And they're worth stating here, that their rights as British subjects. They have the right of assembly. They have the right of petition. They have the right to be tried by a jury of their peers. They have the right to be free of a standing army. They have the right to choose their own assemblies. These are not radical. These are the rights of a British subject. But their feeling, for logical reasons having to do with these acts that have been passed, that some of these things are now being questioned or threatened or even quashed, even if temporarily. So you have the declaration and resolves, and also there is a petition within, along with the declaration to the king, very restrained, basically saying, we don't like what's going on here. Please read this. So that's a very quick and dirty version of what the First Continental Congress is trying to do. I would say there are two big takeaways from the First Continental Congress. One is, in all of this talking and debating and resolving, it forced the colonists to make their beliefs clear to themselves, which hadn't happened before, and to Great Britain, and for the colonists to explain the motives behind their actions. All of these things are going on around them. They have a sense that their rights as British subjects are being violated, but they have to actually sit down and engage in conversation with each other from throughout the other colonies to figure out specifically what do they feel is being violated and what would they like to be done about it. And they do other things that, were their right to protest, right? They write petitions, they make declarations. All of these things are traditionally what you as a British subject would have the right to do. And in doing all of these things, they are trying to clarify for themselves, for Britain, exactly what it is they want, what they believe, and the fact that they've managed to have that conversation and put something on paper, that really matters a lot. The second, or a second, important thing about the First Continental Congress is that it forced people from separate colonies to meet one another, to work together for an extended period. For many of them, the first time they've done anything like this. It's a major, major, what do I want to say, experience for many of these people in the First Continental Congress. It's not like, oh, well, I guess I've been elected to a Congress. I'm going to go and meet in a Congress. It's like, whoa, okay, there are people coming from all over. Many of these people hadn't necessarily traveled very far from their home ever. The colonies did not naturally join together and unite to do things together. So the fact that these things were happening, and then all of these men gathered in a room to try and work this out, that was pretty major. And you'll see, I mean, this is way down the road, but when it comes time to constitution making, one of the things that the framers of the Constitution say, Alexander Hamilton, first Federalist essay, first paragraph, he says, one of the distinctive things that's happening right now is that we may be proving for all time whether you can put a group of people in a room and have them create a government through reason and debate and choice, or whether governments are always going to be based on warfare and happenstance. And that idea of people coming together and doing things in a way that felt orderly and representative, that idea goes back to this period as well. And then the final thing that the First Continental Congress does is they call for another Congress to meet next spring, May 1775, if their grievances had not been met by that time. So they do all of these things, and then they say, okay, we'll wait, take some months out, see what happens. And if our grievances have not been met, then we're going to have a second Continental Congress. Now, one or two other things, actually, before I've lied, I'm going to take one or another 2 more minutes, because it's worth also noting a difference between the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress. A lot of what I just said focused on Parliament. I mean, the king is there, but Parliament is the star of what's going on. Part of what you see in the evolution of the colonies from being upset at violations of their rights to becoming rebellious is a migration away from their clinging to the king. When you look at the mindset of colonists, what you see, and you can see it bubbling in the First Continental Congress, the colonists are capable and willing to take a step back from Parliament and say, they're not looking out for our interests, even saying to the king, Parliament is full of evil counselors. Don't listen to Parliament. They're not thinking of our good. like good British subjects, the colonies cling to the King of England as someone who they see as the great father, someone who they're loyal to, someone who's central to their identity as British subjects. And what you see happen in 1776 particularly, and then ultimately with the Declaration of Independence, is the colonists slowly, step by step, pulling themselves away from the sense of loyalty to the king. And Thomas Paine's Common Sense in early 1776 helps with that. But it's a huge thing. It's a major thing for people to tear themselves away from, in a sense, what was at the core of their identity as British subjects. And that's the King of England. You can even hear John Adams, and you could see in his letters, he's struggling with this dramatic change. So one point of all of this, First Continental Congress, and even into the Second Continental Congress, is the degree to which this is a step-by-step process. It's bound up with colonists feeling that they deserve what other British subjects get and deserve. And they're trying to petition and meet and boycott and do things that felt to them as the best way and a more typical way of trying to act as British subjects to make their rights, their demands known. Okay, I just literally took like 31 minutes. And I want to open time for conversation here. And I hope, like I just happily, let me change my screen here. I just happily blathered for a half hour. So I hope I covered the sorts of things you folks want me to. But I'm very, very happy to address questions too.
Well, thank you. And thanks all of you. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. We have plenty of time. We also, to start, have some questions from Chris from the Virginia Geographic Alliance. We wanted to make sure to thank Chris and the VGA and also the Virginia Council for History Education for co-hosting tonight so we could have Joanne here with us. So a couple of questions from Chris, and I'm going to combine a couple, but first of all, were there any interesting travel delays? And then kind of what were the dynamics of the meeting like? These might be two separate questions. What were the dynamics of the meeting like in terms of things like travel and lodging? We'll start there.
Well, so those are good questions because travel was tricky and travel took a long time. I remember I worked for a while. I was employed for a while by the Library of Congress. And I remember finding a Continental Congressman's almanac, a copy of his almanac that he kept, and that as he was traveling to Philadelphia, he was recording the expenses of his trip. Like, I fed my horse and it cost me this much. I stayed in a tavern and it cost me this much. Step by step by step of him trying. He was from New England, I think, trying to get his way down to Pennsylvania. So it was a big deal. And for many, you know, maybe the furthest they'd traveled, that in and of itself was a big deal. As far as, you know, where people were living and how they were living, you did have, you know, some people sharing space. You know, it's one of the things, I mean, this gets into the kind of history that I love to do. I'm always interested in how the human dynamics of the political process shape the politics that come out of it. So these sort of questions like, how did people get along? What did they think of each other? Did they like each other? Could they talk to each other? Were they hostile towards each other? As trivial as that sounds as questions, they're going to fundamentally affect what can happen in the room where it happened. I can't help it. In the room where it is happening, right? They're going to affect what happens in the Continental Congress. So certainly, particularly in the first, but even in the Second Continental Congress, they're kind of figuring out how to get along with each other. In some ways, sometimes comical, but they're trying to, you know, Southerners are looking at New Englanders and thinking they seem awfully, you know, stuffy and stuck up, and they're wearing very drab clothing. And people from the North are looking at Southerners and saying, we're in all of these fantastic, frivolous clothing, and they're loud as heck. Who are these guys? So they're learning about each other almost as though they're learning about people from foreign countries.
I like that. And we have a couple of different questions asking about the men who attended the First Continental Congress and just how different they were in terms of occupations. Were there variations in terms of how all of this affected, how different personalities then affected the outcomes of the First Continental Congress?
Sure. So there were a lot of differences. A good number of the men who were there, but not all of them, had some experience in something political in their colonies, but not all of them. A lot of them were lawyers, not all of them. And so, I wouldn't say they were like representative of all of society, because it's a pretty, generally speaking, a pretty elite body. But still, there was a spectrum of politics involved. You had some people who were very radical, and you had some people who were really not. So again, it's not like revolution. It was a room of people all trying to figure out, what do we think? What do we have in common? What do we, what should happen here? That matters, that there were people who you might classify as loyalists in the First Continental Congress. So, in a sense, what's happening is what ideally should happen in a body like that, which is you have people who fundamentally disagree about things in a room debating. I know nowadays that sounds radical. People who disagree with each other in a room in conversation, but that was something that was happening in this Congress. That's, again, the most obvious thing in the world to say, but that's the essence of what our government is grounded on, right? That you can get people in a room, they don't agree, they might really hate each other's ideas, but in one way or another, they're going to bang up against each other and come up with something that ultimately people can kind of agree on. Debate and compromise. That is, and the framers and the founding generation weren't naive about this. They didn't think that everyone would come together with stars in their eyes and magically come up with ideas. They understood, they expected, clashing and argument and disagreement, but they fundamentally assumed that people who come to serve in some kind of an assembly ultimately are there in part because they want to join with others and come up with a solution to problems. Shocking. I know, that's shocking.
We do have some questions along those lines as well. But one more question on this theme. What about John Adams? We had some questions about John Adams possibly rubbing people the wrong way. Were there other kind of big personality clashes?
Well, so John Adams, I mean, particularly in the Second Continental Congress, where I'm sure a lot of you have seen the movie 1776. I know every lyric and every line in 1776. I've seen it far too many times. And there's, a song in which he acknowledges that he's obnoxious and disliked a lot, right? And he was, right? He was obnoxious and disliked. He was not shy. He wanted what he wanted. He was impatient with those who didn't want it. So yeah, he was not an easy person to get along with. I will say he's one of my favorite founder folk to write about, because he, as much as he is obnoxious and disliked, he has some self-awareness. And so he knows he's being obnoxious, right? I mean, he's the one who says that about himself. He has some self-awareness, which not every, I'll make a big general statement, not every elite male in the world has that sense of self-awareness. In the founding period, a lot of them don't. And he did. He still was a difficult man, but particularly when it came to independence, and that's the Second Continental Congress, he really is standing up for what he wants and being, in a sense, uncompromising in a way that, for the rest of his life, he was proud of, right? That he did what he felt needed to be done. And as I said earlier, you can see him get to the point where he feels that now independence must happen. It's not an automatic pilot thing for him, but he is someone who comes to that conclusion and then is very loud about the need for it to happen. And it's hard to exaggerate the degree to which, and I realize this is the second, not the First Continental Congress, but it's John Adams, the degree to which declaring independence, breaking away from the king, doing this as a group, taking that kind of a radical act was huge for these colonists. They understood in declaring independence that they were risking their lives, that they were committing treason, basically. They knew that, right? That wasn't just words. And they were willingly doing that. Now, Adams lives a long time. He lives to old age. And people, a lot, the founder folk who lived for a while into old age, strangers would write to them basically saying, tell us about, tell us about whatever, tell us about the Continental Congress, tell us about the writing of the Declaration of Independence, right? Because it's just like, I don't know you, but you're a founder, and I really want you to tell us about it. And what was clear was Adams got a lot of those letters because he lived a while. And it was clear that letter after letter after letter, people were saying to him, essentially, tell us about the magical moment when independence was declared, right? Tell us about the fairy tale past. And Adams had the same response over and over and over again, which was, we didn't know what we were doing, number one. Number two, we made mistakes all the time. And number three, there was nothing fairy tale-ish about it. And my favorite example of that is someone says, tell me about the writing of the Declaration, the signing of the Declaration. That's what he wants. What happened when the people signed the Declaration? And he says, this will be a bad paraphrase, I sat there and I watched men sign that document. And what I saw was a lot of people who are not happy to be signing that document. I saw people who were unsure of what they were doing. I saw people who were unhappy with what they were doing. We didn't know what we were doing. And some people weren't thrilled with what we were doing. And it's not as though there was a perfect founding moment where everyone was united and somehow better than everyone else and that everything has been downhill since then. He said again and again and again, we were no better than you. We didn't know what we were doing. We were improvising. We were in the moment. We did stupid things a lot. We made mistakes. We didn't think in the right way. We thought about ourselves and not about other things. And in his mind, and this is something I think about a lot nowadays, what he was saying is, it's not as though there's a perfect founding moment that we can never get back to, and that everything since then has been downhill, and no government and no politician can ever live up to that generation. In his mind, and in the minds of many others, that was essentially a crime against the founding, because it suggests everything is downhill after that little moment, and in a sense, the job is done. Like, well, the founders did it, created a constitution, started a government. Okay, what a great bunch of guys. And his point, which he kept saying over and over and over again, was, oh no, like, don't you go on into the future and compare your government with us and say, oh, this current government is so horrible. He was like, no, we weren't perfect. And you folks darn well better keep doing the work and doing what has to happen. It didn't end with us. We don't think about the founding that way. First or Second Continental Congress, we don't think about the founding that way, as a starting point for something that's ongoing and not an end in and of itself. And that's so important to bear in mind. They themselves said it, right? So it's not even like I'm some highfalutin person in the 21st century saying, here's how you should think of the founders. They themselves, thankfully, John Adams said, don't think of us as these perfect founders. It will do a serious injustice to all government that comes after us. You shouldn't be thinking that way. He felt that that idea was being responsible to the people to come. He assumed, rightly, that the government that they were putting in effect, obviously not in the First and Second Continental Congress, but in the Constitutional Convention, required ongoing activity and protection. It was not, there's no end point in democratic governance. It doesn't end. You keep going and you try to make it better. And in a sense, that's what Adams was saying. Nothing ended with us, folks. We've put something in motion. And now it's up to you to keep that going. And we forget that. I'm veering a little off Congress, but we forget and have forgotten that what we have, the democratic governance that we have, is fragile. That we shouldn't take it for granted. I think we forgot that for quite some time. And I think we live in times when hopefully we have been awoken from that kind of slumber of self-satisfaction and realize that what we have and what we can improve on is something of value, something so worthwhile that it deserves preserving and working for. And there are moments in time, and this is true of the First and Second Continental Congress. Adams says at one point, some equivalent of this, which is, there are moments in time when you have to stop and pause and you realize that something bigger than you is happening, that something important is happening, that you have to take stock of where you are and what you think and what's happening around you and what you're going to do about it. And that's how people felt about what was going on, particularly in these early phases of the revolution, First Continental Congress, even into the Second Continental Congress. And that's where we are now. These are not the only two moments in American history when people ideally have been able to stop and pause and think, this is bigger than me, folks. This is bigger than normal. This is a moment that requires some thought and some action. But, I just wrote a piece maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and what it was about was looking ahead to the 250th anniversary. I was asked, as a historian of the revolution, what am I thinking about when I think about that? And one of the things I talked about was the revolution, more than anything else, is about spontaneity. It's about, and anyone who's here for my Normal History Matters program will know I'm about to say contingency because I say it every single week. But, contingency is what the revolution was about. No one knew it would happen. No one knew what they were doing or why. It was one big hole of, what are we doing? All contingency. And we're in a moment when there's a lot of questions, a lot of contingency about where we're going or what's happening next. What my piece talked about was that it might be useful for us as we head towards, 2026, to think about what it means to live in highly contingent times and what that requires of us, and to look to the revolutionary generation as a way of reminding ourselves that you get these moments and that these moments matter. I will now get off of my soapbox. I get myself all wound up. So.
There will be more opportunities, trust me. So let's, thinking about Britain for a moment, doesn't the situation or the existence of the First Continental Congress say something good about England, the fact that these meetings were not suppressed but allowed to happen, so that maybe the disagreement didn't go forth?
Well, so here's an interesting point about this, that, I've been teaching at Yale for 27 years. How that happened, I don't know. But at one point, I was teaching my American Revolution course, and there was a guy who sat in the front row who was British, student. And he held me to account. I would say things like, well, the Battle of Yorktown, and I would go off on my rant, and he would come to me at the end and say, let me get this straight. This little group of British soldiers held off the French and Americans for a long time? Like, don't they get credit? It's like, well, yeah. And one of the things that he asked about, which was right to be asked about, and which I then talked about, was the fact that we also think of Parliament and the British as being a unified force of opposition. And the fact is that there were people in Parliament who supported the colonists, who understood what they were doing, who agreed with the rights that they were declaring. So it's not as though, the Snidely Whiplash evil Parliament was like, let's clamp down on the Continental Congresses. There were people there in Parliament who thought, well, of course they're doing this. They have the right to do this. They're asking for what we have. So that's important to bear in mind too. What's at stake here in the colonies, and to some degree in Parliament, are fundamental British rights.
And how did things like travel delays affect Britain's reaction? Well, first of all, how did Britain react? And then how did some, travel time just factor into their reactions?
Well, travel time factored in a lot, right? Because you would do something in the Continental Congress, declaration and resolves, a petition, let's send it out. And it would take months, right, to get there. And then it would take months to get back. It was like, even within the colonies, right? I've already talked about how they're trying to create an infrastructure so that colonies can tell what's happening in other colonies. That's not easy to do. So that could have a major impact. There's a line that I think was cut from Thomas Paine's Common Sense that addresses this. I think it ended up on the cutting room floor. But what he basically says is, I'm not gonna do it justice, but it's basically, we're tired of having to run down to the harbor to see when the British ships come in how many of our rights we have left. It makes a huge difference, and the thing is, colonists always identified with the British Empire, always identified with London, the king, Parliament. That was the center of their universe. But they were really in the outback. They didn't necessarily always see themselves that way, but they were pretty far removed. And there's scholarship on the fact that like Carrie Ann Yakota wrote a book called, I think, Unbecoming British, about how the British would take like sort of messed up goods that were like second rate, and sell them in the colonies, because they're like, oh, the colonies will never know, they're those crazy outback people. They don't understand what's good or bad. So the distance and the time had a huge impact. I see Annie and Carolee are here, so I'm just like, I see History Matters people here, and I just have to applaud them.
There are a lot of History Matters people here. Hello. So how about this? What would you say was the final straw that shattered the loyalty between the colonists and the king? Was it common sense?
No. Well, I wouldn't say that is the thing. I would say that was really important in getting people, as I mentioned a moment ago, to actually pause and question the existence of the king and what he did. Paine, if you haven't read Common Sense, read Common Sense, because what Paine is doing in there is radical, right? Given how the colonists felt about the king, what he's doing in there is sort of swatting at that kind of reverence. He calls the king, I think, the royal brute, a worm crawling along the ground. He's doing all of these things to just slam down the king and what he represents, intended to be shocking, intended to get people to say, whoa. And if nothing else, people don't necessarily have to go that far, but the intent of Common Sense is to get people to actually be able to take a step away and say, maybe we don't have to keep marching along on this road, because maybe the king has out-kinged himself. He's unkinged himself. And maybe that's what's going on here. So I think Common Sense helped change people's mindset. But I think it's a chain of things that happened.
So, related question, aside from time, what other things separate the First and the Second Continental Congresses?
Well, so by the time the Second Continental Congress comes along, and what the First Continental Congress tried to do didn't get acted upon, so now you've got the Second Continental Congress, and now you've got Lexington and Concord. Now you've got British troops firing on American colonists. And it's another one of these revolutionary moments that it's hard to capture the intensity of that and what it meant, and how shocking, how stunning that was, that British troops had fired on and killed colonists. British troops weren't foreigners. I mean, by the time you get to Lexington and Concord, colonists are ticked off at the British troops for a bunch of reasons, but still, they're still assuming that they're part of the same mix of people. There's an account I use when I teach Lexington and Concord, and it's a boy recalling how as people, I think as the British were marching, I can't remember whether they're to or from Concord, and his father runs out and he recognizes, he knows some of the British soldiers, and he runs out to talk to them so that he can find out what's happening. These aren't strangers, right? These people had been living around in the area. They knew, some colonists knew the soldiers. So that idea that British troops had fired on colonists. When I was researching that for the first time for my American Revolution course, what I found were people remembering later exactly where they had been when they heard that news. Just like, we remember precisely where we were when we heard about 9/11. I remember precisely where I was when I heard about the Challenger explosion. When there are things that happen that are so beyond the pall, that are so shocking, that you remember exactly where you were when you heard it. And that's how some people experienced hearing the news of Lexington and Concord. Like, what? How? How, how could that have happened? What does it mean? And now suddenly you really have to question the British, the troops, are they really considering us British subjects at all? What do we need to be doing to prepare ourselves? By the time you get the Second Continental Congress, now you have to be starting to think about war. Now we got to think about what's going on here. We're not let's run into war, but now we're at a different place by the time the Second Continental Congress meets. And now you have to at least be thinking about what happens down the road. That's, when you get George Washington, who's named the commander-in-chief of the troops, et cetera, et cetera. So the mindset by that point is different. I have to tell you about Powder House Day in New Haven, because it's related to this. So I learned about Powder House Day, and I have to say, I had been teaching at Yale the Revolution probably for a decade at this point, and I got in a taxi and I talked to everyone, and I talked to the taxi driver, and I said, he said, "What are you teaching?" I said, "The American Revolution." He's like, "Oh, then you must know about Powder House Day." No. Well, apparently they celebrate this every year, and what it celebrates is when the news of Lexington and Concord got to New Haven, Benedict Arnold was so shocked that he went to demand the keys to the powder house so that he and his local militia could march up to Massachusetts and fight. And every year New Haven celebrates Powder House Day and celebrate Benedict Arnold. So to me, it's a fascinating thing. But the point of why I told that story is there's that moment when the news is so shocking that happened, that he and others are ready to just arm themselves and run because they can't believe that line has been crossed.
Okay, we have so many good questions, but I want to make sure that we get this one in.
Okay.
Was the First Continental Congress a bigger deal in 1774 or 2024?
So I'm not sure. So the question is it a bigger deal to us now? Sadly, I would say no, because I think with a lot of people probably who are here, people don't know what it is or what it did or why it was important. 2026, man, that's going to be a time when we can really drive home the meaning, the full meaning of these things in the context of the present, right? In the current moment. There's so much about that period and living through that period that so relates to the period we're in. So I would love it if I could say, yes, the First Continental Congress matters to people. I think in a world where people don't even read the Constitution, I don't know if they're thinking about the First Continental Congress, but I love the question.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So what might our current lawmakers take away from the Continental Congress, or what advice might the First or Second Continental Congress offer today's political parties to help us repair, in particular, some of the hate speech and divisiveness?
Well, to go a little off of some of what I said, there were people particularly in the Second Continental Congress, there were set loyalists, but also in the First Continental Congress, There were people who did not want to break away. There were people who did not want independence. There were people who fundamentally did not agree, and this was a big deal. And they stayed in the same room and argued. You know, in a not necessarily in a democracy, but in any democratic form of governance, it's grounded on, number one, the people, public opinion ultimately has the power. And number two, their representatives are supposed to get together and argue and yell and scream and do whatever they do, but they're supposed to be able to be in a room together and fight it out. And sometimes some people win and sometimes other people win. But the idea that you and what you believe and the people who like you are all that count, and if people disagree with you, throw them away, that is not how democratic governance works. That is not what our Constitution is grounded on. That is not what our government is intended to be. We may really hate some of what other people believe. They have a right to believe those hateful things, right? I mean, we have certain fundamental rights to believe what we want to believe. There might be people who, by our individual standards, are pretty hateful and believe some pretty reprehensible things. But the solution to that isn't kill, crush, destroy, right? I mean, so fundamentally, if you have somebody who is saying, if you disagree with me, you're not American, you're out, that's an outlier opinion. That is not how our government is supposed to operate. That is not what the United States of America is supposed to be. And, you know, at least you can point to the First and Second Continental Congresses and say there were people with some pretty strong disagreements about what should happen. And some of them left, some of them stayed, they argued. That's what's supposed to happen, right? That's what representative assemblies are about.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of them. But thank you, Joanne. I want to turn it over for one more minute to Dalton.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I did want to end by telling everyone again a little bit about our upcoming webinars this week. So we have a webinar tomorrow, co-hosted with the National Council for the Social Studies. Where are we now? Book banning and censorship in 2024. And then on Wednesday, we have a webinar with Peter Piccone, a U.S. history teacher, on AI in history education. And then on Thursday, we have a webinar, Breaking Barriers, the Critical Role of Black Men in Education, with Jaquez Taylor, Jeffrey White, and Jermaine James. Again, thank you all so much for joining us.
If I could add something?
Yes, go ahead, Joe. Oh, and then, oh wait, no, I did. It's down at my bottom of my list here. And then on Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, History Matters and So Does Coffee with Joanne. And I know we've got Annie here too. Please join the community. Anything you'd like to say, Joanne?
Well, it's so I think Carolee is here, so she'll know when I get it wrong. I think we just had our 232nd episode. So since the beginning of the pandemic, Carolee says, I think, thank you. Then I don't feel so bad. I forget every week. But let's say it's roughly 232. We get together every week. We talk about history and we talk about how it can help us interpret what's going on now with politics. It's a real community in the sense that you come, you will be welcomed. And I'm so proud of the people who meet every week from all over the world to engage in this conversation. Please come and join us. You don't have to sign up for anything. You don't have to pay anything. You just have to go to the link, ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations, or on Facebook, beam in. It's also at that same address I just gave you, ncheteach.org/conversations is where we archive episodes, so you can look at past episodes too.
Thank you, Joanne. And yeah, every Friday, make sure and join in. So
10:30 a.m. Eastern Time.
Yep, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Joanne, and have a good evening.
Have a good evening, everybody.